Hello and welcome to this Strategic Thinking webinar. This is a production by Dodds Training and me, Claire Fisher, for the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. It is part of our bespoke package of training for MHCLG, including this introductory webinar and then a workshop called Tackling Strategic Challenges, which will be happening on the 19th of November at 10 AM. A recording of the webinar and the slides for the webinar will be made available to everybody attending the workshop. I am Claire Fisher. I am a former senior civil servant. I've worked across the UK public sector and internationally, and I specialise in strategic thinking and public policy leadership. I teach public policy masters on the SOAS programme. So let's kick off today and kick off this webinar by thinking about what is strategy. I do a lot of work on strategic thinking with different groups, and people often begin by wanting to know actually what is strategy. A lot of people that come on our training have been told they need to be more strategic, but they're not really sure what that means. So in this webinar, we're going to unpack a little bit about that. We're going to think about what strategy actually is, particularly in the public sector context, and what it means to be strategic, so that we can start to understand the kind of tools and techniques that you need to answer some strategic challenges and how you can find more strategic space in your own practice. So let's have a look at this question then. What is strategy? What is the function of strategy? This model might be familiar to some of you. It comes from the Treasury Green Book and it describes the functions of an organisation in the public sector. We see that we've got strategy, policy and delivery, and these are terms that are no doubt familiar to you. At its most basic level, the delivery question is the answer to everything about the what that we do. What is it that we actually do? Where does our service make contact with the real world? The policy question is the how, and the strategy question is the where. So strategy is about the future facing, direction setting, vision element of the work of a department in the public sector. It's the answer to this big question: where, direction setting and future facing. In the public sector, we talk often about strategy as the function where we intend to change the future. This is something that's so exciting, this ambition, that the rationale very often for intervention in public services is about looking forward to a future and thinking, if we don't get involved, something that we don't want to happen will happen. So we're going to get involved. We're going to get involved to reduce homelessness or reduce crime or to tackle obesity or to improve public health. The rationale for getting involved is often to change the future. And so the strategy function, the strategic function in the organisation, is the bit about looking ahead, looking forward, reimagining the future, if you like. And in public policy, the future is unknown. Well, in all situations, the future is unknown, but there's something very particular about the challenge of strategy in the public sector. And that is that we have to deliver regardless of what the future holds. So we have to find a way of dealing with uncertainty. We can't be paralysed by not knowing what's coming in the future. We have to have some kind of method and mechanism and framework by which we continue to deliver despite uncertainty. So strategy is the process by which we do that. And just because this diagram looks hierarchical, don't be confused, don't misunderstand that strategy has to happen at the top of an organisation. The strategic function can be done by people of any level at any part of the organisation, but it's crucial that there is a part of the organisation and that there is a function of strategy, looking forward and looking ahead. And it may well be that there are elements of strategic work and strategic thinking within policy and delivery roles. It's the bit where we look ahead, where we look forward, where we make plans, where we try and aspire to change the future, and a process by which we deal with uncertainty. So in this session, we want to lay some foundations and some real key concepts as we get going, as we get started. We've been talking about strategic and we've been talking about the idea that it's high level, future facing and direction setting, some really important ideas there. There's also a big idea that you will hear talked about fairly often in public policy, and that is complexity. When we talk about something being complex, we mean that it has variable inputs, it has interdependent components and unpredictable outputs. And for many academics, complexity is the very definition of the public sector, and it is the complexity of the work that we do and the complexity of the public sector that make the challenges that we face so interesting and so unique. Often we are dealing with living systems, we're dealing with human beings as part of that system, and the interactions between the components in the systems that we deal with mean that we need a system level response. So strategic thinking helps us do that. It helps us see the bigger picture, because we understand from strategic thinking that it's not in digging into the detail that we find solutions, but by just pulling back and seeing the system, seeing how all the bits fit together and making the kind of recommendations for solutions that will deliver an effective systems level change. We understand as well the potential for change. The thing about a system and the thing about a complex system in particular is that there is a potential for change. We're not static, it is a dynamic thing, and this gives us cause for optimism and gives us opportunities for intervention. It also means that we see that the relationships between the people in the system and between the components in the system are more important than the individual things. So these three concepts, the idea of strategic and strategy, the idea of complexity, and the idea of systems, are things that we'll come back to during this webinar and during this training, and these really are the three key concepts that you will be working with and grappling with during this strategic thinking training. And if you feel you're being tempted to get down into the weeds and to get too far into the detail, just remember that if it is a strategic problem, it needs a strategic, high-level, future-facing solution. It needs to understand that the answer is unlikely to be simple for a complex problem, that we need to understand the relationships and the dynamics of the problem, and that we need to understand the whole system, not just our part within it, and that to neglect the relationships within the system are likely to deliver some really disappointed and unexpected results as we think about the kind of solutions that we're looking at. So today, our introductory session, we're thinking specifically about strategic thinking. This is a skill set for strategy. So what does that mean? What is strategic thinking? So strategic thinking is a way of thinking about the future for organisations and for individuals, where you are able to articulate a compelling vision of the future. It provides a process and a framework for dealing with uncertainty. It doesn't necessarily resolve uncertainty, it certainly doesn't future-proof anything or guarantee success, but it gives you a way of thinking and articulating and holding uncertainty in a professional manner. We'll talk a little bit about why things go wrong, why people fail at strategy, and part of that is being drawn into the now. It's the risk of adrenaline. We'll cover that a little bit more later on in this webinar. But a good strategic thinking framework insulates you against the risk of adrenaline and cognitive overload, and it embraces the whole system. As we've said, system solutions are critical for success with strategic problems. Now, I've noticed a real increase in demand for strategic thinking training very recently in these days, and I don't think that's surprising, actually. I think strategic thinking matters more now than ever. And in the public sector, we are seeing a real need and a demand for good strategic thinking skills. And this is because currently there is an exceptional burden on the public sector to rebuild and restore the economy and society. The challenges we face, we've probably overused the word unprecedented, but really like a scale that we've never seen before. So we are facing an exceptional burden. And there is an extraordinary demand of the now. We will talk about this concept in a little while in this webinar. But the extraordinary pressures on the now bring a lot of our resource and our capacity out of the strategic level, and that really gives us the risk of there being a strategic void at the top and overloads at the bottom, and that adds up to organisational failure. So strategic thinking and a clear model about how we understand the crucial roles in the organisation and the relationship between those roles becomes really, really important, so we avoid the strategic void and we avoid the strategic overload and we avoid organisational failure. And finally, we've talked about complexity, but there are increasing levels of complexity within the systems that we work in and the nature of the problems that we are dealing with. And this really does increase the demand on us and demands comprehensive systems level responses. We operate in a volatile and uncertain environment, and so we need to be really careful that our strategic responses include a strategic response to risk, and understanding the different levels of risk at the strategic level as opposed to the delivery level is also something that is really important and often overlooked. So the public sector. What is the public sector? I don't know if you've ever paused to think what it is that makes the public sector special or unique, or how the public sector defines itself, or why one kind of problem is a public sector problem as opposed to another kind of problem. When I ask delegates on courses this, we often have a bit of a blank look, and then as people begin to think and begin to wonder, they might come up with the idea that we do whatever it is that the government funds. And I might say to them, but why does the government fund some things rather than others? And we have a further head scratch. And there's also something there about the idea, well, the government funds things because the private sector can't, or because the private sector has failed. We also have some kind of idea about there being an ethical element, so maybe some sort of decision about protection of a minority, or to do something for the public good. A conversation about public good will often lead us into this idea that it's something for the good of the whole of the public, so we can't separate it out, we can't monetize it, individuals can't buy into it. So things like clean air and good infrastructure often become the kind of things that the public sector gets involved in. There's often things to do with the idea of a nation state as well, things that the nation can do, perhaps like defence or treaties. And also then there's something about the way that we are accountable, or the way that the governance is organised, perhaps something around the democratic element and the decision and the mandate and so on around the public sector. So it doesn't take us very long thinking about this question to understand that the public sector is something quite different. We are very often asked to do the things that the private sector find, frankly, too difficult or too impossible. So the kind of challenges that we face are the most difficult, the most complex, the most challenging. But also we operate under some really quite difficult time constraints. Very often the pressure to deliver in the now is intense in the public sector, and you can't turn off the public sector system while you reset it. You have to both plan for the future but also continue to deliver for the now. And I think, having worked for many years now with leaders and people in the public sector, I think we often feel maybe that we're not quite as good as the people in the private sector because there's a lot of negative stories out there about inefficiencies in the public sector and how things are better and more efficient in the private sector. And now some of that is true. There are certainly things that we can do better. But I think it does pay us just to pause for a moment and just appreciate that the level of the challenge that we face in the public sector is very different. The scale and the nature of the strategic challenges that we face in the public sector are of a different nature and of a different scale, and the consequences for getting those wrong are incredible. So we need to, I think, feel encouraged by how much we have achieved, and also take time to learn the type of skills that we're talking about today in terms of how do we do this stuff really well? How do we find space and time to do this stuff really well? We shouldn't be surprised if just the kind of gut reaction answers aren't sufficient to the kind of strategic challenges that we face. We should expect to have to learn and adapt as we go. Now, Sir Gus O'Donnell was a really senior civil servant when I first joined the civil service, and he said to us when I first joined as a fast streamer, if you think you've got the simple answer to a problem, you probably haven't understood that problem. And he was very supportive and very encouraging of us. Working till our brains hurt was a thing he used to talk about. This idea that as public sector strategists, public sector policymakers, we should be engaging with the most difficult, most challenging problems. And often the kind of answers that we come up with will be around the best fit or trade-offs or compromises. There's very rarely one perfect answer for the kind of problems and challenges that we think about. And I know that in this programme you are looking at policy, you're doing policy courses as well, and I know that colleagues of mine who are leading the policy courses will be helping you with policy frameworks to think about how we develop solutions appropriate for the kind of public sector challenges that we're facing. So to bring it back to strategy for now, I want us to talk about the meaning of strategy in the organisation and some of the particular features of public sector strategy, taking that appreciation of the challenges that we're facing forward as we think about this next section. To take a minute to pause and to reflect, what does strategy mean in your organisation? I've talked about the kind of challenges that we've worked on. I've said that they're complex, that they're challenging, that they're difficult, that maybe sometimes we feel intimidated by the scale of the challenge. Do you recognise that description of the kind of problems that you work on? What are the big strategic issues that are facing you and your team and your organisation right now? And if a systems response is so crucial to getting anything right at the strategic level in the public sector, how well do you understand the system that you work in? These are some questions that I hope you will consider and bring your thoughts with you into the workshop. We will be having a discussion and a Q&A as the beginning of the workshop, so we may come back to some of these questions later. I want to introduce you now to the strategic space model. It is a framework for strategic thinking in the public sector, and it can help organisations and individuals think about how to improve strategic thinking and their own strategic practices. You'll be familiar now with the three-level model that we have looked at so far today. The Treasury model talks about the where, the how and the what of the delivery, the policy and the strategy level. And in this model we also need to consider the who, the customer, the client, and the why, the rationale, the meta strategy, if you like, the direction setting and the vision. And these questions will help us understand the purpose of the different sections of the organisation and also help us diagnose some of the issues that happen within organisations. This is based, this part at least, on the work of Barry Oshry, whose blog Total Systems Power you can find online. He describes what happens at the different levels of an organization in a functioning and healthy situation. So as we have talked about already, at the strategic level, the purpose is to have the vision, to look forward, to do direction setting. And at the bottom, at the delivery level, there's the fixing of the day-to-day. And then the role of the policy, we've talked about connection. It's an integration role to help the policy connects the strategy to the delivery. And we see this very much in the civil service context. The arrow that you can see there on the screen describes how the policy function will be feeding information up from the bottom level in the form of briefing, and then communicating and cascading information down into delivery level. And in a healthy functioning organisation, this is what we see. In a dysfunctional organisation, Barry Oshry describes that the problem is characterised by a fixing at the strategic level, and when the delivery level or the bottom of the organisation see the top doing the fixing, they become disengaged. And then rather than connecting and integrating, the policy level ends up making selective connections. They don't want to connect the top and the bottom when they're not doing their primary function. So there's a selective connection which drives silos. And just thinking there a little bit about the purpose of vision at the top and the difference between vision and fixing. This idea that the fixing is what happens in the now. So it's like keeping the current car on the road, if you like, the checking of the oil and the tyre pressure and so on, while the vision level is about considering how we get to electric or hydrogen power cars in 10 or 20 years' time. We've also talked in this model about the who, the customers, the clients, the patients, the students, and you can see Oshry talks about their reactions as being a symptom as a part of this diagnostic for helping us understand the state of the organisation. So in a healthy functioning organisation, the green words on the screen at the moment, you can see that your who validate your system. They are pleased to be associated with it. They feel loyalty and ownership towards it. If it's the NHS, this is the moment where they want to stand on the doorstep and clap for their NHS. In a public sector context, of course, one of the features is that our customers, our clients, are who, they don't have a choice. So whereas in a private sector system, they may go elsewhere if the system fails to function properly for them. In a public sector situation, rather than taking the business elsewhere, what we see is this entitlement reaction. So rather than being proud and validating the system, they start to complain that they're not getting value for money, and we see this disengagement trickling down to the level of the customers and the clients. And it all really comes from the problem that the people who should be at the top come down into the now and do the fixing. Why do these clever, intelligent, capable leaders who know that their role is at the strategic level end up coming back down into the now to try and fix something despite all the problems that it causes? Now, this is a question that I've been pondering and that I have been asking and discussing with leaders across the public sector for many years now, and some really important themes have come up, and I'm going to suggest a few to you now, and do by all means in the workshops, let's discuss this and see whether you recognise any of these issues. I think there is something around a lack of understanding about what the strategic role is and the importance of it, and some sort of sense almost of an imposter syndrome, that people aren't quite sure when they reach the strategic level what their job is at that level, and they kind of revert to the thing that they last felt comfortable doing, the last real job. So we see a lot of head teachers who are desperate to be back in classrooms, or managers in the health service that try and get involved with clinical practices. It's trying to going back to a thing that you understood, because it's quite hard to understand the value of the strategic function. I think there's also something about wanting to be seen, wanting to feel useful, and wanting to demonstrate leadership. And often that comes because there's a bypassing of the middle. So maybe we don't have a proper functioning middle, a proper functioning a policy level in civil service terms that properly integrates the top and the bottom. So there's this sense of the people at the strategic level feeling separate from the now. They want to be connected, and the only way they can see to be connected is to physically go and to be present in the now. And so there's something there about an organisational issue around a lack of connection between the top and the bottom. But there's the most crucial reason that I've discovered in the years that I've been thinking and teaching about this, and it's adrenaline. Now, adrenaline does some really incredible things to your brain. Remember the last time that something happened that overwhelmed your brain with adrenaline? What did it feel like? Maybe you've had to call an ambulance for somebody that fell down sick in front of you. That's happened to me a couple of times. And we want to consider in this model as we think about strategic space is risk. The appropriate attitude to risk is different at different levels and with different functions of an organisation. And again, this is taken from the Treasury model. And I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar how a good strategic framework helps us handle the idea of uncertainty. And of course, in the Treasury definition, uncertainty and risk are very similar concepts. And the Treasury model shows us that risk is different at different levels of the organisation, and that the further up the organisation you go, the greater the level of acceptable risk. And I think this kind of just makes sense actually when you think about it, because the further up the organisation you go, the further into the future that part of the organisation should be looking to, and therefore the larger the amount of risk. So when you're looking 5 or 10 years ahead, there will be quite a high level of risk. When you're dealing with the now, we want to manage it much more closely down to zero. And this is another reason why it's so important that we have a really clear idea about the strategic function and the different kind of skills that are required to operate at the strategic level. So strategic leaders need to be comfortable with the idea of quite a large amount of risk, and particularly those who have been promoted up through the organisation need to understand that as they are promoted, as their role changes, their attitude to risk needs to change. So those who have learned to be successful by managing risk down to zero in the delivery level, who then maybe in the policy space are used to trading off the long-term and the short-term risks, and have got comfortable with this idea of compromise and options, at the strategic level, we need to find a way of looking to the future and managing the uncertainty of the future and the higher level of risk at the future, in the future. Understanding that we can't do everything, we can't get everything right, we can't future-proof our strategies, but being comfortable with that higher level of risk. And I highly commend the Treasury guidance on risk management. If you haven't come across it, this is the sort of foundation of many ideas within the suite of materials that the Treasury have produced. And as we think about the conclusions, I want to ask you to consider what incident command can teach you about strategic thinking. Now, there are some bits of the public sector who are used to dealing with emergencies, who are used to working very much in the now under some extreme conditions, under adrenaline, and who have understood that having the whole organisation pile into the now to try and fix a thing is not only inadvisable, it's frankly dangerous. And so you will find these incident command structures in the emergency services and in the military, wherever you are dealing with proper life and death emergencies, that the now is separated but connected from the future looking levels of the organisation. And this stuff is so important, the learning about how risky it is to have the whole efforts of the organisation focused in a now, the dangers of having a strategic void, how unsustainable it is, how that will lead to burnout. This is baked in to the way that we organise our responses to emergency situations. And I think we can learn a lot from this set of ideas. So you might be familiar with these terms, with the idea of gold, silver and bronze, and you can see how neatly it maps across into the strategy, policy, delivery, or the future now models that we've been talking about. And in the incident command model, they know that it really matters that you set aside the bronze command, the people dealing with the now, are very, very separate from the gold command. The gold command are the people thinking, how do we run this operation tomorrow and the next day? How do we get the resources? How do we keep the people safe? And if you've ever been in a gold command environment, you will know it feels surprisingly calm, actually almost boring. Because it is insulated from the now. It will be a separate room, often a hotel room or a conference suite, or a purpose-built operations room, perhaps at a police station or in a military installation. Sometimes it's just like a trailer or like a mobile home or a caravan if it's a bit low key, but it's always a separate, physically separate space that brings together people whose main focus is planning for the next day and the future. But there is also a silver command whose job is to connect the two, to do that work of the policy space that we've talked about, bringing information from the now into the strategic space and reporting the decisions back out to the delivery level. So this idea that there has to be a separate strategic space that performs an absolutely critical function that does need to be connected into the now is baked into our emergency procedures, into our incident command structures, and I think really can be the blueprint for us as we think about what it takes to do strategic thinking well in our organisations. So what it boils down to then, we've been talking about strategic space, we've talked about what is strategy, we've talked about some of the principles, some of the Treasury models, bit of the psychology, but it boils down to this, that strategic space is an understanding that strategy absolutely needs to be a separate function within the organisation, that it has a purpose and a value in terms of direction setting and vision forming and sustaining the organisation into the future. And in that strategy function, there needs to be good strategic thinking, good clear thinking about the future. That has to stay future focused despite the pull of the now, that the strategic function must be separate but connected to the organisation. We've understood that the systems and the relationships within the systems are so important, and thinking about how we build, maintain and develop those relations is a really important part of strategic thinking. We also need to understand our context and our external environment, the kind of things that will affect the kind of decisions that we are making. So as we come to the end of this webinar, I'd like you to encourage you to think about what better strategic thinking looks like for your own personal practice. So strategic space is about good strategic thinking, and it requires clear strategic space. You need to be intentional about this. Find and protect your strategic time. This might mean blocking out your diary and turning off distractions, because it's just not possible to think strategically and juggle the pressures of the now at the same time. So as we draw this webinar to a close, I'd just like to invite you to reflect and consider, how would you rate the strategic health of your own organisation? All things considered, from what we've thought about today, what would the score be that you give your organisation out of 10? And how would you encourage them to make up those marks that they're missing? What one recommendation would you make to improve the strategic health of your organisation? And because this is about skills for strategy, what are your early thoughts about how this framework could help you think about the way you organise your work or thinking around a current strategic challenge? And if you have a particular strategic challenge in mind, do let us know and we can try and incorporate it into the workshop. And on a personal level, what personal adaptations could you make to incorporate strategic space into your own personal practice? So in addition to your own personal reflections, you may also want to have a look at some of these resources before our workshop. As I've mentioned, we will be kicking off the workshop with a Q&A, and I want to make the whole workshop really interactive. So if you do have questions or thoughts or responses, do please let us know in advance so we can be sure to include those. And in the workshop, we will be looking at how to use strategic tools, and specifically we will be working through scenario planning as a group exercise and thinking about how to apply some of these ideas specifically to the work of your department. So I look forward to meeting you then. Thank you so much. We'll see you soon.